My name is Maggie Taylor. I'm 38 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I nearly died at my sister's wedding. The guests were laughing, the music was playing, the champagne sparkled, but as I reached for my fork, my husband leaned in and whispered, "We're leaving. Now." He didn't explain until we were outside. What he saw saved my life. Before I tell you the full story, tell me, where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. It was a beautiful California afternoon, the kind where the sun felt like a warm blanket and the air carried the scent of blooming jasmine. Jessica, my younger sister, looked radiant in her lace gown, her smile wide and unburdened. We had grown closer, significantly closer, since Dad passed. His death had ripped a hole in our family, a void that, surprisingly, brought us together in a way life never had. After years of quiet rivalry, a subtle dance of comparisons and unspoken resentments, we'd become, not just sisters, but friends. Real friends. The kind who knew each other's deepest fears and smallest joys. I wanted this wedding, this day, to be perfect for her. Every detail mattered. I wore the dress she had picked for me, a soft periwinkle that she swore brought out the blue in my eyes. I smiled through tears during her vows, tears that felt genuine, brimming with happiness for her and a quiet sense of hope for our shared future. I believed, truly believed, that she had finally found happiness, a solid ground to build her life upon. My husband, Robert, a firefighter, calm, grounded, deeply loyal, sat beside me. His presence was always a steady anchor in my often turbulent emotional landscape. His hand rested on my knee, a familiar comfort. As I raised my glass to toast the happy couple, my voice wavering slightly with emotion, I believed I was witnessing love, celebrating a new beginning. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of happy conversation, the golden light filtering through the marquee tent, it all coalesced into a picture of pure, unadulterated joy. A rare moment of quiet contentment in a world that often felt chaotic. I remember thinking, this is what it feels like to be truly happy for someone you love, to see them finally get their fairy tale. The scent of roasted rosemary and something sweet, like vanilla and berries, wafted from the kitchen. I could hear the distant clatter of plates, the hushed instructions of the catering staff. Everything was meticulously arranged, from the delicate floral centerpieces to the perfectly folded linen napkins. Jessica had obsessed over every detail, and it showed. The entire setting was designed for celebration, for new beginnings, for happiness. And for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to bask in that illusion of perfection. I was wrong. So terribly, profoundly wrong. Dinner began. Beautiful courses arrived, each one elegant and carefully prepared, a testament to the high-end catering Jessica had insisted upon. The first course, a light arugula salad with candied pecans, was delicious. We chatted, Robert and I, about the speeches, about how lovely Jessica looked, about plans for our upcoming anniversary trip. The conversation was light, easy, the way it always was with him. Then the main course arrived. A perfectly seared piece of salmon, accompanied by roasted asparagus and a vibrant green sauce. When the fish came out, Robert's demeanor shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't know him as intimately as I did. He went still. Completely, utterly still. His eyes, usually warm and expressive, locked onto the plate in front of me, a focus so intense it was unnerving. I thought he was just reacting to a memory, maybe a particularly vivid one from his work, or perhaps just lost in thought. His mind was always working, always observing. I almost reached out to touch his arm, to pull him back to our conversation. But then he leaned in. His voice was a low murmur, barely audible over the gentle clinking of silverware and the background hum of conversation. "Get up. Don't eat it. We're leaving." My immediate reaction was confusion. And embarrassment. A flush rose to my cheeks. Leaving? Now? In the middle of the main course at my sister's wedding? What would people think? Had he suddenly felt ill? Was there an emergency at the station? My mind raced through possibilities, none of which seemed to fit the intensity of his gaze. But the look in his eyes? It wasn't panic, Not the kind of frantic energy I'd seen in him when a fire was roaring out of control. It was something else entirely. It was certainty. A quiet, unshakable conviction that radiated from him. And I've learned to trust that look. It was the same look he had when he knew a building was about to collapse, or when he saw a path through smoke and flames that no one else could. It was the look of a man who saw something others couldn't, something critical. My heart began to beat a little faster, a tiny drum in my chest. The embarrassment faded, replaced by a growing unease. Without a word, I nodded. We slipped out as quietly as we could, a silent, almost imperceptible ripple in the festive atmosphere. Heads turned, a few curious glances, but no one stopped us. Robert's hand was on my back, a gentle, guiding pressure. Each step felt heavy, burdened by an unspoken question that hung in the air between us. The salmon sat untouched on the table, a vibrant green sauce glistening innocently under the warm lights. It felt like a trap I had narrowly avoided, though I couldn't articulate why. The world outside the tent, the warm late afternoon air, felt suddenly different, sharper, as if a veil had been lifted. We didn't speak until we reached the car, a silent understanding passing between us. He drove away from the bustling wedding venue, past the manicured lawns and valet parkers, turning onto a quiet, tree-lined street in a residential neighborhood. He pulled over, killed the engine, and turned to me. The silence in the car was profound, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets and the faint murmur of traffic from a faraway highway. The last rays of the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the empty street. It was a beautiful, ordinary evening, juxtaposed against the extraordinary tension that hummed between us. "Did you notice Jessica talking to the chef?" he asked, his voice low and steady, cutting through the quiet like a surgeon's scalpel. I shook my head, my mind still reeling from the abrupt departure, trying to make sense of his urgency. I had been so caught up in the moment, in the joy of the day, in the feeling that everything was finally settling into place. I'd seen Jessica flitting around, talking to everyone, laughing, glowing. She was the bride, after all. It seemed natural. "I did," he continued, his gaze unwavering, fixed on my face. "She was by the kitchen entrance earlier, just before dinner was served. I saw her speak to the chef, then she pointed directly to your plate, Maggie. Not mine, not anyone else's. Just yours." My stomach tightened. A knot began to form, cold and hard. This wasn't an ordinary conversation, not a casual observation. Robert didn't miss details, especially not when it came to my safety. Then the chef, he went on, his voice dropping slightly, pulled out a small bottle. One I recognized. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, allowing their weight to settle. My breath hitched. A cold dread began to seep into my bones, a creeping chill that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. "It was peanut oil," he finally said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Just the facts." My stomach dropped. Not just a knot, but a sudden, violent plummet, like a stone in a deep well. The world tilted on its axis. Peanut oil. My life-threatening peanut allergy. The one that had landed me in the ER twice, gasping for breath, my throat closing, my body screaming in protest. The one Jessica knew about. The one everyone in my family knew about. It wasn't a secret. It was a medical fact of my existence, a constant, low-level hum of vigilance that I lived with every single day. I've carried an EpiPen since I was a child. I've read ingredient labels with the precision of a forensic scientist. My family, especially Jessica, had always been so careful. Or so I thought. "She knew," Robert said again, his voice echoing in the quiet confines of the car, each word a hammer blow to my fragile sense of reality. "She gave the order. That dish, Maggie, that dish could have killed you." I sat frozen, staring at my hands in my lap. They felt alien, disconnected from me. The delicate lace of my dress, the faint scent of jasmine clinging to my hair from the wedding tent, it all felt distant, unreal. My mind was a kaleidoscope of fragmented images, Jessica's beaming smile, the glistening salmon, the small, innocent-looking bottle, and the stark, horrifying implication of it all. She knew. My own sister. The one I had just toasted, the one I had shared tears of joy with, the one whose hand I had held after our father's funeral. Why? I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips, raw and ragged. Why would she do that? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. My mind struggled to process it, to find some logic, some explanation for such a monstrous act. It defied everything I thought I knew about family, about love, about the bonds we shared. The betrayal wasn't just a revelation, it was an amputation, severing a part of me I didn't even realize existed until it was gone. The shock was a cold, numbing blanket, wrapping around me, stifling any other emotion. Grief, disbelief, a searing pain, they were all there, beneath the surface, waiting. But for now, only the shock remained, a quiet, devastating stillness in the core of my being. Everything had changed. Everything. Robert didn't answer my question immediately. Instead, he reached into the back seat, retrieved a slim manila folder, and handed it to me. The simple act felt weighted with meaning. My hands trembled slightly as I took it, the smooth paper feeling strangely cold against my fingertips. I opened it, my eyes scanning the official-looking documents within. The words blurred at first, then slowly, painfully, came into focus. It was Dad's will. Not the copy I'd seen, the simplified version our lawyer had given us. This was a more detailed, intricate document filled with legal jargon and specific clauses. And there, stark and undeniable, were the figures. You inherited 70%, Robert said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, as if acknowledging the fragility of the moment. She got 30%. But if you died, it all goes to her. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not the kind that makes you gasp, but the kind that saps the air from your lungs, leaving you hollow and breathless. If you died, it all goes to her. The phrase echoed in my mind, a chilling pronouncement. It wasn't just about money, it was about motive. A motive so cold, so calculating, it defied belief. A memory surfaced, unbidden, like a phantom limb ache. It was from last month, a casual conversation in the kitchen while we were making coffee. Jessica had been unusually quiet that morning, nursing her mug, her gaze distant. Then she had asked, almost too casually, a strange question. What happens to your share if something ever happens to you, Maggie? Like, if you were gone. At the time, I'd brushed it off as morbid curiosity, perhaps a lingering anxiety about our father's sudden passing. I'd laughed, even, and made some flippant remark about my robust health. Now, the words replayed in my mind, not as a casual query, but as a carefully placed probe, a test, a chilling glimpse into her true intentions. The innocent conversation transformed into something sinister, a prelude to the horror that had just unfolded. Suddenly, every detail clicked into place, not with a gentle click, but with the violent, jarring sound of shattering glass. The forced smiles at dinner, a little too bright, a little too fixed. The meticulous seating arrangement, ensuring I was directly across from the kitchen entrance, in full view. The specific dish, the salmon, which she knew I loved, and which she knew, with absolute certainty, could be laced with death. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't even a moment of recklessness. It was a plan. A cold, deliberate, premeditated act. The realization was a devastating wave, washing over me, leaving me trembling in its wake. The grief, the disbelief, the searing pain, they all surfaced now, raw and untamed. My world, which had felt so stable and secure just hours ago, had imploded. Everything I thought I knew about my sister, about my family, about my place in the world, had been utterly destroyed. It was a pivotal moment, a fracture point from which there would be no going back. The woman who left the wedding venue was not the same woman who had entered it. And the quiet devastation that settled over me was a profound, silent scream that no one else could hear. The initial shock, a cold, numbing blanket, slowly began to recede, replaced by a deep, aching void. There was no dramatic outburst, no screaming, no tearing of hair. Just a profound, quiet devastation. It felt as though a vital organ had been surgically removed from my chest, leaving behind a hollow space that echoed with silence. I spent days in a fog, moving through the motions, answering necessary questions in monosyllables, my gaze distant, unfocused. The apartment, usually a haven of warmth and familiarity, felt alien, the silence within it a constant reminder of the chaos that had erupted inside me. Robert, bless his unwavering strength, was a silent sentinel, his presence a comforting weight. He didn't push, didn't demand explanations, didn't try to fill the void with platitudes. He simply was there, a steady hand, a quiet anchor. My mind, however, was far from quiet. It raced, replayed, analyzed every interaction with Jessica over the past few months, searching for clues, for signs I had missed, for a hint of the darkness that had festered beneath her seemingly cheerful exterior. Every kind word, every shared laugh, every sisterly embrace now felt tainted, grotesque. Was it always there? This insidious undercurrent of resentment, of avarice? Or did Dad's will simply unleash something that was lying dormant? The question spun in a dizzying vortex, offering no answers, only deeper wounds. But slowly, incrementally, something shifted. Amidst the chaos of my shattered perception, a tiny, almost imperceptible spark ignited. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a quiet, cold resolve. Like a broken bone beginning to knit, a painful, slow process of repair. I wasn't going to collapse. I wasn't going to let this consume me. The victim mindset, though tempting in its profound sadness, felt suffocating. I began to observe. Not just Robert, but everything around me. I noticed the way the light fell through the windows at different times of day, the subtle changes in Robert's expression as he watched me. My senses, dulled by shock, began to sharpen. I started reading again, not for distraction, but for focus. Books on resilience, on rebuilding, on the quiet strength that arises from adversity. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, not in despair, but in a profound, unsettling contemplation. My thoughts were no longer a chaotic mess of pain, but a deliberate, almost surgical examination of the situation. How did this happen? What were the exact steps? What did I need to do now? The idea of revenge, hot and impulsive, never truly took root. It felt too messy, too exhausting, too much like letting her continue to dictate my emotional landscape. Instead, a different kind of strength began to form. A quiet, strategic thought process. If she had planned this with such cold precision, then my response needed to be equally precise. I was no longer just the victim of betrayal. I was an agent of change, albeit a silent one. I started making lists in my head. Mental inventories of every interaction, every suspicious glance, every seemingly innocuous comment. Robert, sensing the shift, began to share what he had done. He hadn't just filed an anonymous report. He had meticulously documented everything he saw, every observation from that night. He had a natural eye for detail, honed by years of assessing emergency scenes. He had thought to discreetly photograph my plate with his phone. He had noted the exact time of Jessica's conversation with the chef. He had even remembered the brand name on the small bottle the chef had used. His quiet diligence was a powerful testament to his love, a stark contrast to Jessica's calculated malice. I started to collect my own evidence, without even realizing I was doing it. I went through old text messages with Jessica, searching for patterns, for phrases that now held a double meaning. I found a text from her, weeks before the wedding, asking about my upcoming life insurance policy renewal. At the time, I'd thought it was just her being considerate, making sure I was financially secure. Now it was a chilling piece of the puzzle. I printed out every relevant text, every email, every photo that might hold a clue. I created a mental timeline, mapping out the progression of her increasingly strange behavior. Each piece of information, each collected detail, was a small victory, a tiny step away from the abyss of victimhood. My emotional resilience wasn't forged in a sudden burst of anger, but in the quiet, steady accumulation of facts. It was like building a wall, brick by brick, against the tide of despair. The process was painstaking, emotionally draining, yet oddly empowering. I wasn't reacting, I was preparing. I was no longer lost in the wreckage. I was sifting through the debris, salvageable piece by salvageable piece. The shift was subtle, internal, almost imperceptible to anyone but me. From victim, I was becoming a strategist. From devastated, I was becoming determined. The quiet planning was not about vengeance, but about reclaiming my life on my own terms. It was about finding my footing, gathering my strength, and preparing myself for the next, inevitable stage of this journey. The sting of betrayal was still there, a constant ache, but now it was laced with a chilling clarity. The quiet planning, the meticulous collection of details, began to coalesce into something tangible. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic revenge, but a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the balance of power. A turning of the tide that felt both inevitable and profoundly satisfying. The first ripple came not from my actions directly, but from the methodical, relentless work of Robert's anonymous report. The hotel, faced with a serious liability issue, had no choice but to cooperate fully with the authorities. They reviewed the kitchen footage, a silent witness to Jessica's insidious act. The surveillance video, captured from an overhead angle, showed Jessica, clearly visible, engaged in a hushed conversation with the chef. Her gesture was undeniable, a pointed finger towards my specific plate, isolated from the others. Then the chef, with a moment of hesitation, reached for a small bottle. The brand name, though blurry, was consistent with Robert's earlier identification, a well-known commercial brand of peanut oil. The confirmation was clinical, irrefutable. But the real turning point, the moment the balance truly shifted, came with the discovery of the texts. The police, following up on the initial report and the visual evidence, had obtained warrants for Jessica's phone records. Among hundreds of mundane messages, a series of texts stood out like a beacon in the dark. Messages exchanged between Jessica and her fiancé, David. Mundane at first, then growing increasingly specific, increasingly chilling. One particular exchange made my blood run cold, even as it provided the damning proof I needed. Jessica, in a text to David, had written, "Finally, we can use Maggie's inheritance to open the second location. This will change everything." The timestamp of the message placed it just hours before the wedding dinner. Another text from her a few days prior read, "Just confirming Maggie's allergies are noted by the catering team. Extra careful with her dish." The twisted irony of the words, the thinly veiled intent, was stomach-churning. It wasn't about concern, it was about laying the groundwork, creating a plausible deniability, a smokescreen for her sinister plan. When confronted with the evidence, David, her fiancé, looked utterly horrified. I wasn't there, but Robert relayed the account from the police. David, a man I had always considered quiet and perhaps a little too trusting, had reportedly gone pale, stammering his disbelief. I didn't know he had insisted, his voice reportedly cracking with genuine shock and despair. I swear, I would have stopped her. He claimed she had told him the inheritance was from a separate, minor trust fund Dad had set up for me, one that would only activate upon my unexpected passing, a story she had spun with careful precision to manipulate him. He had believed her, swept up in the dream of their new business, blinded by ambition. It was a flimsy excuse, perhaps, but the depth of his shock, the genuine anguish in his voice, resonated even in Robert's retelling. He had believed her, or at least allowed himself to be convinced. Now, the full, ugly truth was laid bare. The consequences were swift and devastating for Jessica. David, reeling from the realization that the woman he was about to marry had attempted murder for financial gain, divorced her. Not just called off the wedding, but legally divorced her, severing all ties. The public humiliation, the utter betrayal, was too much to bear. His dreams of a second location, built on such a dark foundation, crumbled into dust. Then came the legal ramifications. With the kitchen footage, the peanut oil confirmation, and the incriminating texts, the evidence was overwhelming. Jessica was formally charged with attempted murder. The news spread like wildfire through our small, interconnected community. The whispers, the shocked gasps, the disbelief, it was a storm of public opinion, each gust tearing at the carefully constructed facade of her life. My quiet revenge wasn't about shouting from the rooftops or gloating. It was about the truth, meticulously uncovered, allowed to speak for itself. It was about the slow, inevitable unfolding of consequences. Jessica didn't fully realize what was happening until it was too late, until the walls of her deceit crumbled around her. The satisfaction wasn't malicious. It was a profound sense of justice, a quiet triumph of truth over deception. And for the first time since that terrifying night, I felt a flicker of something akin to peace. The turn had happened, and the quiet unraveling had begun. The fallout for Jessica was swift and brutal, a public implosion that reverberated through every facet of her meticulously curated life. Socially, she became a pariah. The carefully crafted image of the beloved, charming younger sister, the radiant bride, shattered into a million pieces. Friends, many of whom were mutual acquaintances from our shared childhood, recoiled. Invitations ceased. Her phone, once buzzing with calls and texts, went silent. The whispers followed her everywhere, cruel and relentless, stripping away her dignity. She was no longer just Jessica. She was the one who tried to kill her sister. The shame, thick and suffocating, became her constant companion. Financially, her world began to unravel with equal speed. David's divorce, finalized swiftly and without contest, left her with nothing from their joint ventures, nothing from the dreams of a second business location. The funds she had so desperately coveted, the inheritance she had plotted for, remained firmly out of her grasp. Legal fees mounted, a crushing weight that forced her to sell assets, to liquidate what little she had, just to keep her head above water. The grand wedding she had planned, the symbol of her supposed success, became a stark reminder of her downfall, a financial black hole. Emotionally, the consequences were perhaps the most profound. Her carefully constructed reality, built on deceit and manipulation, crumbled around her. The constant scrutiny, the isolation, the weight of her actions, it all took its toll. I heard reports, secondhand, of her withdrawing, of a haunted look in her eyes, of a nervous tremor in her hands. The vibrant, confident woman I had known, the one who could charm her way out of anything, was gone, replaced by a shadow of her former self. My focus, however, was not on her demise. I wasn't seeking vengeance. My journey was one of healing, of reclaiming the life she had so carelessly tried to extinguish. It was a long, arduous process, like navigating a labyrinth with no clear map. The initial shock had given way to a deep, lingering grief, not for her, but for the loss of a sister, for the shattered illusion of family, for the innocence I could never retrieve. I wept, not in despair, but in a cleansing, cathartic release. I allowed myself to feel the pain, to acknowledge the depth of the wound. I started with small, deliberate steps. I revisited my favorite hiking trails, immersing myself in the quiet solace of nature. The rhythmic crunch of leaves under my boots, the scent of pine needles, the vastness of the sky, it all helped to ground me, to remind me of the beauty and resilience of the world outside my own personal trauma. I began to practice mindfulness, focusing on my breath, on the present moment, on the simple fact of being alive. It was a way to quiet the intrusive thoughts, the constant replay of what-ifs and why-nots. My work, which had always been a source of purpose, became an even stronger anchor. I poured myself into projects, finding a sense of control and accomplishment in the tangible results of my efforts. I spent more time with Robert, truly appreciating his unwavering support. Our quiet mornings over coffee, our evening walks, the simple act of his hand in mine, these moments became precious, imbued with a new depth of meaning. He never tired of listening, of simply being present. His love was a steady, constant warmth against the lingering chill of betrayal. My friend Sarah, who had quietly been a rock through this ordeal, became even more vital. She didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, she brought over my favorite comfort foods, sat with me in comfortable silence, and shared stories of her own struggles, reminding me that even in the deepest valleys, life continues and healing is possible. One afternoon, as we sat on my patio, sipping iced tea, she looked at me with a profound understanding in her eyes. Blood doesn't define family, Maggie, she said, her voice soft but firm. Loyalty does. And your true family? They're right here. And she was right. My true family sat beside me that night. Robert, my steadfast husband. Sarah, my loyal friend. My mother, who, after the initial shock, had reached out, tearfully apologizing for her own blindness, for always leaning on me and never truly seeing Jessica for who she was. I always leaned on you, Maggie, Mom had confessed, her voice choked with regret. You were always the strong one, the responsible one. I never asked anything of Jessica. I see it now. I should have seen it. I had hugged her then, a long, tight embrace, the first genuine physical contact we'd shared since the revelation. You didn't do this, Mom, I had whispered, my voice thick with emotion. She did. And it's not your fault. It was a crucial step in my own healing, releasing the residual resentment I had unknowingly carried, a quiet forgiveness of her unwitting part in the setup. The consequences of betrayal, I realized, were not just a linear trajectory for the betrayer. They were a complex web, impacting everyone involved. Jessica's actions had shattered her own life, but they had also forced me to confront uncomfortable truths, to reevaluate my relationships, to redefine what family truly meant. The process of healing wasn't about forgetting, or even forgiving in the traditional sense. It was about integration. About acknowledging the trauma, learning from it, and choosing to move forward, not with bitterness, but with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper appreciation for the genuine connections in my life. It was about reclaiming my peace, one quiet, deliberate breath at a time. The scars would always be there, a faint reminder of the darkness, but they no longer defined me. They were simply part of my story, a testament to my resilience. And in their subtle presence, I found a quiet strength. 3 weeks had passed since the charges were filed, since the world truly began to spin off Jessica's axis. 3 weeks since I almost didn't wake up. Each morning, I still woke with a slight tremor, a phantom sensation of fear, but it was fading. This particular morning, the sun was streaming through the kitchen window, painting stripes of warm light across the counter. The scent of coffee filled the air, mingling with the subtle sweetness of ripening fruit. Robert was at the stove, flipping pancakes, his movements easy and familiar. The mundane normalcy of the scene felt sacred, a quiet miracle after the storm. I stood beside him, pouring juice into glasses, the clinking of ice a soft, reassuring sound. I looked at him, truly looked at him, his strong profile illuminated by the morning light. The lines around his eyes, the slight silvering at his temples, testaments to a life lived with purpose, a life dedicated to protecting. If you hadn't seen that, I said, my voice quiet, almost a whisper, the words heavy with the weight of their truth. If you hadn't been so observant, I wouldn't be here right now. He turned, a gentle smile gracing his lips. He didn't need to say anything grand, no sweeping declarations. He simply reached out, his hand cupping the back of my head, and kissed my forehead. It was a soft, tender kiss, a promise in itself. Protecting you is my mission, Maggie, he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my hair. Simple words. Profound meaning. Outside, a new day was rising, unfurling its subtle beauty. The birds were singing, a cheerful chorus celebrating the morning. Life, in its stubborn, resilient way, continued. I may never fully understand why Jessica did it. The twisted logic, the cold avarice, the depths of her betrayal, it remained a dark, unplumbed abyss within her. Perhaps I never would, and perhaps that was okay. The need for an explanation had lessened, replaced by a different kind of understanding. I didn't need revenge. The wheels of justice were turning, slow but relentless, and the consequences of her actions were already unfolding, creating their own bitter harvest. I didn't hold on to the bitterness either. It was a heavy cloak, and I had shed it, piece by painful piece. Forgiveness, in the traditional sense, felt impossible, an act of erasure I wasn't ready for, maybe would never be. But letting go? That was different. Letting go of the anger, the obsessive need for answers, the constant replaying of the wound. That was liberation. I had the truth. And with truth came a clarity, sharp and unyielding. My freedom wasn't just physical, it was a profound emotional and spiritual liberation. I was free from the illusions, free from the false narratives, free from the insidious grip of deceit. I was free to redefine my family, to choose those who loved me, truly and unconditionally. I was free to build a life based on genuine connection, on unwavering loyalty, on a love that was not predicated on inheritance or manipulation. And now I live. I live surrounded by the people who love me not because they have to, not by obligation or by blood, but because they choose to. Because they see me, truly see me, and they value my presence in their lives. The path back from betrayal had been long, winding, and at times, utterly terrifying. But I had found my way. And in that journey, I had found myself clearer, stronger, and more profoundly alive than ever before. Have you found your way back from betrayal?